Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
If you don't make your product here, then you will have to pay a tariff, a very substantial tariff, when you send your product into the United States. And by the way, you know, for years they knocked the word tariff, properly used, is a beautiful word. One of the most beautiful words I've ever heard. It's music to my ears. A lot of bad people didn't like that word, but now they're finding out I was right. And we will take in hundreds of billions of dollars into our treasury and use that money to benefit the American citizens. And it will not cause inflation, by the way.
It's a feature of today's political landscape that every event, big or small, is instantly enlisted by every faction as proof positive of whatever view the faction held before the event anyway. And so it is almost with every aspect of Trump's victory, except one, his threatened tariff war. It is the one thing at which one can sense both hard-right proponents of Anglosphere cooperation and free market fundamentalists bristle. In fact, there are reports that it is a major bone of contention between Donald Trump and his chief pom-pom shaker/stalker, Elon Musk. But is Trump really an economic illiterate, or could his plan actually work by sheer virtue of American muscle behind it? And where would it leave the global economy? What would it do to inflation? What would it mean for a Britain stuck in the middle of a possible trade war? I spoke to trade expert David Henig, ideally placed to answer these questions. David, thank you for joining us on Quiet Riot.
It is a pleasure.
Okay, Trump will be in office in January. He has made various claims about what he plans to do. We're talking about tariffs today on the main. So can I ask you to just give us a really basic explainer of what tariffs are, how they work, the sort of circumstances where they can be effective and the sort of circumstances where they're not particularly effective?
A tariff is, in effect, a tax on an import of a good from outside of the country. So you bring in a car or a record or a pharmaceutical product from outside the country. Perhaps you pay £10 for it. And if the tariff is 10%, you pay another £1 for bringing that good into the country. That's the actual basic. Mm-hmm. What that has the effect of doing is that it means that domestic production receives some kind of preference. So effectively, a domestically produced good of the same type can now be produced for £11 and be competitive with the one that would have been imported for £10, to be crude in the valuation. Now, the cost of an input is not the same as the price that you will pay in the shops. There are many other factors that build up to that.
So the importer and retailer might decide to absorb a little bit of
distribution, various things, but it does have an effect on prices. Now, what nearly all economists agree is that tariffs are actually economically not very good. Why is that? It encourages production, essentially, that is not best value for money. So it can shelter inefficient production in one country by making it more expensive to bring in more efficiently produced goods from another country. Now, there are arguments that are made reasonably to say, what if I am developing an industry and I don't want it to be destroyed while I'm doing that? There are arguments, for example, about what if things were produced in other countries without good labour laws or environmental laws, similar sorts of things. And indeed, that is reasonable. And
also, I guess, on industries and sectors of strategic significance, there might be a logic behind putting tariffs on steel imports, for instance, because it's considered important from a security point of view to have a steel production capacity within the country.
Indeed, one needs to be a little careful with the argument of something of strategic value, because that's a very good excuse for everybody to lobby government to say that their industry is of strategic value and therefore must be protected. I think there's a very good case, for example, for saying pharmaceuticals. Can we guarantee that we've got the production of really basic pharmaceuticals, for example? There may be a very good case for, in some cases, saying we do need to have some domestic production, or we shouldn't rely entirely on one other supplier, for example.
Yeah.
But in many cases, if it is the case that we are receiving supplies from friendly countries in the EU or the US or similar, and we are selling them similar, well, that's the way the global trade system works, and gradually all of those tariffs have been reduced, and we have a quite nice trading system working where we have lots of choice of goods based essentially around low or almost non-existent tariffs that have been reduced that way through a series of agreements at the World Trade Organization and through bilateral agreements that are called free trade agreements, and that these have reduced tariffs to very little, between 0 and 5% in general, and as a result, we have more choice at lower prices of goods than we have ever had before. I think one other thing that is worth adding, that most trade today is not in fact in finished products at all. It is in components and capital goods that help make finished goods. And that's very important for thinking about the impact of the US, potential action on tariffs. At least 50% of US imports are goods that in turn will form part of a finished product or will help to make it. So it's not all about the export of cars or indeed biscuits around the world. It is very much around, for example, sugar or cocoa beans or bumpers of cars and so on. And that's just the way the modern trade system has grown up.
That makes sense. So what do you make of Trump's consistent claims that it is the other countries that will pay the tariffs?
Donald Trump is a tariff man. There was a famous tweet when Twitter was a thing, when he was on Twitter and when we were all on Twitter. Most of us have now left. But he said, I'm a tariff man. And he said it, I think, in this election campaign, there's no word more beautiful than tariffs in the English language, which is a strange thing to say. But then he is a man that doesn't read books, famously. So he also doesn't necessarily know a lot about trade or about tariffs. So he thinks that somehow through the magic of the American power that other countries will pay tariffs. Now, some costs might be borne by the exporter, but in the first instance, all costs are paid by the importer. And so if you impose that tariff, let's just say we impose that tariff on engines for aircraft, then Boeing will be paying extra for their engines for their aircraft. It's an example I've used a fair amount. And Boeing will find that their own production has suddenly gone up in price and is less competitive as compared to Airbus, for example. So Trump is not only wrong, but I also assume he thinks that all this trade is happening in final products, not in, as we say, the intermediates.
Right. So what do you make of his plan? Do you think it is likely sales puff that will come and go with the election? Or do you think he is actually planning to put 70% tariffs on everything?
So his plan, as stated, is I am going to put a tariff of 60% on all goods from China, and I'm going to put a tariff of 10 to 20% on all goods. Now, we don't actually know whether that's 10 to 20% on top of existing US tariffs, some of which are zero, but some of which are actually much higher, for example, for station wagons. So is that on top of, or is that just a new flat rate tariff? Number one. Number two, though, and more important, those intermediate goods, if you put the tariffs up on them, American producers are paying more. If you put those tariffs up on consumer products, particularly ones where there's no obvious alternate supply, those prices are going up in the US. Given that Trump has just won an election on the basis that inflation was bad, that's not necessarily looking like a strategy that will make him popular. And we know about Trump that he likes to be popular. So the suggestion from most people who have looked at this is that, yes, he will put tariffs up because he says he's a tariff guy, but that he will target particular countries and particular products in doing so. Bad news if you're China, bad news probably if you're Mexico. which is being accused of receiving essentially and rebadging Chinese produce. Not necessarily such bad news if you're the UK, and the UK doesn't sell a huge amount of goods to the US, sells quite a lot, and also Trump is obsessed with deficits and surpluses. The UK and the US have a roughly balanced trade relationship. We don't have much of a surplus or a deficit. Good news for all of this if you're a lobbyist working in DC, because everybody is going to be seeking exemptions or tariffs on their rivals or whatever it is. And so this will become quite a bonanza in that way. But that's the betting, is he will put in place tariffs and fulfill what he claimed, but he won't put them on exactly in the way he said.
Quiet, Riot. Behind the bright lights and adrenaline of pro sports is an equally exciting world of negotiations and deal-making.
That's what we cover each week on our podcast, The Deal.
I'm Alex Rodriguez, former baseball player turned business executive.
And I'm Jason Kelly, chief correspondent for Bloomberg Originals. Over the next couple months, we'll hear from all-stars like Jay Williams.
I want to be an owner one day.
Billie Jean King.
Learn the business.
And so many more. Listen to The Deal on Spotify.
It occurs to me that we are quite used to looking at growth in China as a sort of entry factor into global growth that is really quite important. You know, when growth in China slows down, everyone worries. And we've also just come out of a period of really quite high global inflation. So a huge economy like the US suddenly in one wave putting up loads of tariffs, especially in China. What's the effect on the global economy of that?
So the standard reference point for this is not a good one. This is the 1930s when all the countries put up tariffs and there was obviously a global depression. That's probably not likely to happen in the same way. Good news, slightly, as I'll come on to. Very different economies now, just far more trade, but far more trade in services, and far more trade not involving the US. It's no longer quite the global hegemon that it was. On the other hand, the US puts on tariffs, other countries potentially retaliate. This does have a negative impact. We can expect it to slow down growth. At the moment, you have a situation where all of the EU, China, and the US all want to be domestic producers of goods and not necessarily importers. That doesn't balance very well. So then there's the prospect of surplus goods being dumped onto other markets. That provokes trade conflict as well. You are in a situation, at the very least, where global growth is threatened by all of this. What is quite interesting is that the global financial markets appear to not really be worrying about this. They appear to be going up on Trump coming in, suggesting they don't think any of this will happen. So that's possible, but certainly it is a worry. And if you are investing in new production, you're going to be having second thoughts at the moment about what the global economy might look like over the next 2 to 3 years.
David, there seem to be three main schools of thought on how the UK should react to this potential upheaval, not just on trade and tariffs, but in general, I think the notion of the US becoming again slightly more inward-looking, slightly more America first, slightly less of a reliable international partner, all of which is, I think, a fair prediction of the next Trump term, since it was what happened during his last term. So there's a school of thought that says we must cleave the EU much closer. There is a school of thought that says now is the time to really go for a deal with the United States, because Donald Trump has, I guess, emotional and generational links to the UK, and he will also want to poke the EU in the eye by offering the UK a better deal than he offers to them. And then there's the third school of thought that says the best thing is to try and remain equidistant, what do you think of the feasibility of each and the advantages and disadvantages of each?
Well, there are those schools of thought even before Trump came along. The Nigel Farage view of the world that we should focus on the US and indeed anybody but Europe. And there are obviously those who would want a much closer relationship with Europe. And then the very few who think that somehow the UK can magically rule the waves once again. Look at the trade figures. 50% of our trade, broadly, give or take, is with the EU. Slightly more if you include the countries linked to the EU, like Turkey, Switzerland, and Norway. Probably closer to 55%. The UK cannot afford to ignore 55% of our trade, and that's why, in the end, Boris Johnson did a deal with them. But 15 to 20% of our trade is with the US, so again, we can't fully ignore the US. So in the short term, while we're not members of the EU, we have to do both. There's not really much of a choice that the UK has. But what we do with both is probably what's more interesting. So with the EU, we know about the reset. The government, in my opinion, just needs to send a very clear signal that this is going to be the priority. 50% of our trade has to be the priority over 15% of our trade. So start with that as the UK priority and then say that, well, we also do need to carry on trading with the US in that way as well, and we will look to see what we can do. Bear in mind as well, Donald Trump is not a guy who likes the normal free trade agreement that's thousands of pages long, detailing exact conditions for trade.
That's true.
Last time there was a UK-US negotiation, I'm told that Donald Trump's number one ask was that he would like the British Open golf tournament to be held at one of his golf courses in Scotland.
Right.
This is not going to be a normal negotiation, and I don't know if the UK government has some sway over where the British Open golf tournament is held. Probably not. Or perhaps put a statue of Trump up on one of his golf courses or something. I suspect it's going to be in the non-traditional category. Fine, we have to duck and weave, and in fact, that's what the EU, that's what every other country is going to be doing. But we have to do it within a very straightforward principle. Geography matters, our trade relations matter. That puts Europe more important than the US to us.
Okay, but one of the hurdles, I guess, both with trying to do a US deal, actually, and with trying to renegotiate the trade agreement with the EU, has been that it's not really high on anyone's agenda. Neither the EU nor the US are particularly going to bed and waking up thinking, gosh, we really must do a better trade deal with the UK. And the suggestion, for instance, when I spoke to Jakob Öberg a few weeks ago, was that a Trump victory suddenly pushes defense up the agenda. It pushes security up the agenda. And that is something where the UK does have a lot more to offer to the EU. And that might mean that suddenly the UK becomes a priority partner.
I travel to Brussels quite a lot, and there's something in that the UK is valued as a security partner, but I don't think it fundamentally changes the dial, just as it doesn't fundamentally change the dial in the UK that Trump has been elected, we must rush back towards the EU. It's of necessity, these international processes, I'm afraid, generally are fairly slow and often focused on subjects you might not think of as the priority, like who gets access to the fish in shared waters. And you just have to go through that, I think. It's right to say, still, nobody is going to be waking up saying, this is what we must do. And that's why the UK government, I think, needs to be fairly forward. It's been quite forward on saying we want a reset with the EU. It now needs to follow that up and say, and this is the way in which we want to see that reset develop, and this is why it's important to us. Not necessarily so much about the details, about exactly how many fish we're offering to the EU, but to say, in this situation, with Trump elected, we still believe in trade, we believe in gravity, and we believe in geography, and for that reason, we believe we want to be doing a lot more with the EU.
And yet, I can't help but think that the Governor of the Bank of England's intervention, coming as it did on Thursday, I mean, it can't be a coincidence that someone like Andrew Bailey, who has been exceptionally guarded on the issue of Brexit and our relationship with the EU. In fact, he was appointed on that basis. And so for him to come out now, the week after Trump's re-election, and say, we must look for opportunities to improve our relationship with the EU, it doesn't feel like a coincidence.
Well, I'm not familiar with the politics around Mr. Bailey. For those who follow trade, what he said was entirely uncontroversial, that it's obvious that we need to have stronger ties with our nearest market.
It's entirely uncontroversial, and he hasn't said it before.
Hell, I agree, the politics is changing. I am very pleased because I think that the UK's pathway, under any circumstances, whether you wish to go back into the EU, whether you wish to stay out, the UK needs a little bit of honesty to say, if you put up barriers with your neighbours, you will suffer a little bit economically. That's just economics 101. And it would be nice if a few more people came out in positions of power and influence, like Andrew Bailey, and just said this. And then we can make a reasonably honest discussion. Similarly, that we're not going to have an all-singing, all-dancing trade deal with the US. And similarly, that the actions we're taking at the moment on resetting with the EU are not going to fundamentally transform the economy overnight. In fact, it's very difficult to fundamentally transform the economy with any trade action. So I do feel we need all of these things to be brought out into the open. So there was a sense under previous administrations that you weren't really allowed to speak out in case you got blacklisted, as indeed I was. So I think that is changing, and that must be for the good.
Rachel Reeves also made a significant speech. What did you make of that?
Again, in one sense, it's quite uncontroversial. She said, the UK wants to trade. And if you look at the international figures, the UK public probably is more open to trade than most other countries. So that's a natural position to be in. In the context of where we've come from, it turns out to be very controversial to say we'd like to trade with the US, we'd like to trade with the EU. I think it's important to actually come out and say this up front, because you're starting to set the agenda within which you're having to deal with President Trump. President Trump may come to the UK and say, I want this kind of deal, or I think you should stop trading with the EU. And we've already put that statement out there saying, well, this government believes in open trade with everybody. You set out those principles, you're making it harder for other countries to simply assume that you'll do whatever they say. I think that's what the UK government has to do. I would like to see more of it, as I say. I would like to see them also say, and the EU is inevitably more important than the US. It's said that Robert Lighthizer, who was head of trade under Trump first time round and who is still influential, has in fact said the same, that he believes the UK is fundamentally more of a European power when it comes to trade. Can UK ministers and others be honest about that? It would be good. And in that way, you're starting to stand up a little against Trump and say, this is what we believe, and you are going to struggle to take us off this path into your own. Perhaps we will do some of the things you suggest with regard to China, but that's the nature of the conversation. The nature of the conversation is not, will we move out of the EU zone and into the US zone? The answer is no.
ONS data was out Friday, and it shows another drop in trade.
Global Britain has failed. If Global Britain was the project of the last Conservative governments to replace EU trade, lost because of higher barriers, with global exports, it hasn't happened. Now, to be fair, some of the new trade deals are only just coming on stream now, but we're not expecting a big difference from that. What you've seen is essentially trade has dropped, both goods trade, goods exports, with both the EU and outside the EU. Why is that? It's because if companies are no longer supplying the EU market from the UK, we're no longer a good place to be in terms of supply chains, then there's just going to be less trade within the supply chains globally as well. The UK is no longer such a good base for operations around Europe. There are things that we can do to change that in the reset with the EU, which we should do. And those are the things that the last government instead wanted to make it easier to sell biscuits to Australia or whatever it is. That really is going to make very little difference. And that's what the trade figures are showing.
And there's also been we're going into slightly geeky territory here, but there's been a retirement, which means a rejig slightly in the behind-the-scenes trade negotiation team. And you don't think it's altogether a negative development, I think.
This is the chief trade negotiator, Crawford Falconer. Those with long memories of Brexit matters will remember that he arrived in middle of 2017, and it was often said in the middle of the most fraught negotiations with the EU, bring in Crawford Falconer into this. He showed no great desire to get involved in that. He showed no great desire to ever appear in public either, or to say what he thought. And insofar as I can tell, he was also quite heavily responsible for the fact that the UK government feels that trade negotiations are something that happens in very secretive and darkened rooms, which was maybe the model 20 years ago, rather than the model now, which is more about saying in public and having discussions in public about the sort of areas you want to work on with other countries, and then working for a deal that works for both of you. That's the modern approach. His approach was, by contrast, somewhat dated. So clearly we have got big challenges ahead, but I think that it's good to actually approach those with a new style and think about the things that need to change. So I'm hoping that this will be the start of that, and that government will start doing things a little bit differently.
Can I ask you something else, a little bit wider, David? You may not have a definitive answer to it, but it's something that has been on my mind. Has Trump actually identified a truth at the heart of his policies and his strategies that is unpalatable to the rest of the world, but truth nevertheless, that America is of a size that it can behave badly, that it can, in a way, blackmail other nations into X, Y, and Z?
Certainly, I think that's true. I think there's actually two things that I'm going to say the other one and then come back on the US behavior. I think one is that the US and the global economy does not look like the one that we think it is, that ordinary people think it is, and that creates a divide and a problem, and that Trump, his solutions aim to fill that problem. I think they're the wrong solutions, but I think that it is correct that there is a problem there. And the second part in regard to US power, well, I think that's a dirty little secret around the world trade system and other world systems, is that the US, the EU, and China, as the three main global trade powers, have more power to impose what they believe to be the rules than anyone else. Now, Trump is flagrant about this. I do not care about world trade rules. I'm just doing this. Arguably, China and the EU tend to say, we believe very faithfully in the rules, and here is our interpretation of it, and we dare you all to challenge us. So the EU is doing some things that are considered a little bit questionable by the rules, such as their deforestation regulation, which is causing a lot of concern in a number of countries. So the EU can maybe get away with some of this as well. And China is often accused by the EU and the US of not really following the rules. And where, of course, that leads us, because we're focused on the UK, is the UK can't do that. And the UK, increasingly, we have to navigate as best we can through other countries not entirely following the rules. We have to hope that some rules stay in place, because that does us some good in helping us to keep trading. We have to acknowledge we are the minnows here, and we have to hope that in their contest, none of them get together and try to harm us, because they could. On the one hand, it's a dance between the three major powers, where the EU is going to be closer to the US than China, even though it doesn't really agree with the US over China, but it has to be closer to the US than China. So on the one hand, you have the major powers, and then on the other hand, you have the others, like the UK, who have to navigate our way around those major powers and do the best we can.
That was illuminating, and creates another 50 questions in my head that we must try to answer a different time. I hope to have you back very, very soon. Thank you.
Quiet Riot.
Trade is worth protecting, and protecting fiercely. In the words of Chinese business tycoon Jack Ma, when trade stops, war starts. I hope you enjoyed this bonus episode of Quiet Riot. We do our best to bring you high-quality content that is relevant to the world as it is, neither rosily idealized nor painted clickbait black. You can support our work on Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. Thank you for listening.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads, with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.